Welcome to Orthogonal's webinar on the predetermined change control plan guidance from the FDA on AI and ML. We're going to be talking about kind of what is it about, how and when to use it, look at some examples, and answer a number of questions from our audience. And yes, we'll also be talking about the elephant in the room a little bit. We typically have these webinars for about an hour, but we will stay up to 30 minutes past the hour if there are enough questions. So starting off, my name is Bernhard Kappa. Normally, my colleague Randy Horton runs these webinars, but Randy is out sick today, so I'm covering for him. So if it doesn't run quite the way these webinars normally run, that's my fault. So as I say, I'm Bernhard Kappa. I'm the CEO and founder of Orthogonal. Our company is about, as many other companies are, about improving patient outcomes. But we are all about using fast feedback loops to actually improve those patient outcomes faster while being safer and more effective. So, since the start, we've been working on bringing modern fast feedback loop methods into the medical device space. We've developed a whole set of best practice building blocks, processes, patterns, tooling, how to organize people and teams. And then we work with growth stage startups, with midsize and large medical device companies. We help by building software as a medical device and connected device systems within our quality management system, co-developing with our customers, but then also enabling them to move faster through regulatory and quality consulting, helping them set up best practice building blocks and coaching. We love to share best practices. We learn a lot from others in the industry. We're not the only ones moving the ball forward, but we love sharing and working together with others, such as our colleague Brendan O'Leary and Megan Graham. And, if you would love to talk to us either about projects or, what you're experiencing, we would love to hear things that are going well for you, lessons that you have learned. Happy to share those as well. We want to make sure we're building the community of experts and spreading that throughout the industry. One of the things we do a fair bit is these webinars once a month. Towards the end of the month, we do webinars on different topics in SAMD and device development, software related mostly. And we also have white papers and blog posts. So if you go to orthogonal.io, you will see a lot of those. And I know a number of you have been to our regulars at our webinars. So thank you for joining us. I'd like to have our distinguished panelists introduce themselves, and then we can get started. Brendan, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Bernard. My name is Brendan O'Leary. My education is in mechanical engineering, and I worked at the FDA for about 14 years. Started as a pre-market reviewer in radiology. I had a variety of policy and operations roles in vitro diagnostics and radiological health before going on to help co-found the FDA's Digital Health Center of Excellence a few years ago. I left in April 2023, and I'm now an independent consultant. I help companies either appropriately avoid the FDA, and I'm going to stress the word appropriately there, or when they need to interact with the FDA, I help them put their best foot forward when they're doing that. And thanks for having me today. Looking forward to talk about this.
Awesome. Megan, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Megan Graham. I am Orthogonal's VP of Quality Regulatory. I am new to the Orthogonal team, but I've been in medical device new product development for over 25 years. I focus on quality and regulatory strategies for all kinds of software, digital health, whether you are directly regulated or regulated adjacent, if you will. That's my focus is on establishing your framework to get your idea into the patients, clinicians, and healthcare providers that need them the most.
Great. Well, thanks to both of you for joining us. So let's start with the elephant in the room, right? Lots of government uh, cuts across departments, including the FDA and CDRH in particular. Um, last week there was supposed to be a webinar from the FDA talking about AI guidance that was canceled. A lot of the people at the FDA that were doing AI were let go from the department. We do know that some have been brought back. Not everyone was for various reasons, but this is something that has happened that we are dealing with. How should we look at this in the context of, our work on AI and medical device regulatory?
Well, maybe I'll kick it off. And yeah, I think the sentiment among my clients has typically been some mixture of disgust and anger at what's going on with the cuts, not just at the FDA, but across the federal government. This is really a situation of cutting off our nose to spite our face. We're either robbing ourselves of our immediate future from a public health and economic perspective, or from our more distant future, depending on which agency you're looking at. But in any context, the news is bad. I think, you know, every time I see an FDA employee reinstated, that's a good feeling. That's an important step back in the right direction, and it's important to regain that ground. But I think it's important to note that they're not all back, and they do all need to be brought back. And I'm encouraged by, what I'm seeing from the Office of Special Counsel and others who are stepping in to take a close look at the legality of this, and see what we can do about that. So I think at the moment, the game's not over. People are still doing their due diligence and doing what they need to do to get this fixed. And I think that the people who are working on that deserve and need our full support.
I would absolutely agree with that sentiment. When I think about the regulatory landscape, I know it's always evolving. And so within your own quality management system, your own business strategies and product strategies, there's always been a sense of having to monitor what's going on and try to adapt as best as possible. For right now, the regulatory framework is still in place. These products are still regulated. And when we think about having a resilient QMS and approach for that, that really brings us back to some of the key topics that we're talking about today, which is really having an ability to iterate your product over time. So that part has not changed, because that's the best practice for software and for AI/ML. So as we monitor what's going on and we think about our colleagues, friends at the FDA, and the ability to have quick review times and subject matter expertise within the FDA. Manufacturers, companies that are developing these products can rest assured that there's quite a bit you can do internally to kind of hedge against some of those changes.
Yeah, I would say that, there's a push-pull here. I agree, Brendan, that this is what has happened so far is a very bad thing unequivocally for the industry and for the American people. I do think there are a few things that have, where people are doing things about it, as you've mentioned, within the government, but also people putting pressure on their legislators directly in their districts, but also through groups like AdvaMed, the industry association. AdvaMed has had championed the device fees and paid for a number of employees at the FDA through that. In particular, beefing up a lot of the things that we are dealing with here, and those are some of the people that were brought back. I expect a lot of more lobbying and a lot of things from the industry. All of us can play a part in that to make sure that we're doing the right thing. So not the topic of this of this webinar per se, but it is the elephant in the room here, and we are not powerless in doing the right thing for the industry, for our patients, and for the country overall. So with elephant out of the in the room out of the way, let's talk about our main topic here, PCCP. So Brendan, obviously with your deep experience and background, it'd be great if you could sort of explain how we got to this PCCP thing. Where did this start, and how does this kind of fit in with uh, other activities over time at the FDA?
Sure. So first, what's PCCP stand for? So a PCCP is a predetermined change control plan. That's what the acronym stands for. And the topic that it addresses is the topic of modifications to previously authorized devices. And when I say authorized, I mean cleared, approved, or granted a de novo, or whatever the case may be. That's been a hot topic since the medical device amendments of 1976, I think, right? And so we're talking about an old topic and an important topic, which is when does the FDA need to look at a device again as it's being updated after it's been on the market? The FDA's had a number of policies over the decades to address this. One of the more commonly known one is about modifications to previously cleared devices under 510(k), and there's a nice flow chart there that we can all walk through to understand whether or not a change could significantly affect safety or effectiveness, which is traditionally the standard that is used to trigger an additional regulatory submission. Even back in the early 2010s, when FDA started reviewing mobile medical apps and started contemplating, well, what happens when a new version of the iPhone comes out, or when a new model of an Android phone comes out? How could that impact the safety or effectiveness of these devices? And how do we want to address oversight from that perspective? Industry and FDA and all stakeholders really came together and came up with good approaches to ensuring the ongoing safety of medical device software in those contexts. If you look at, antimicrobial susceptibility tests for antibiotics, again, there's been a long-standing history of collaboration between the stakeholders in this space to understand how do we make sure that these things are safe and effective over time. If you look at orthopedic implants, FDA might have approved envelope dimensions for various bone plates and screws, for example, and manufacturers could manufacture instances of them within those dimensions. And if you look at, say, genetic testing, back in 2016, 2017, FDA had a program for how do you add new variants to an existing genetic test. So this topic, and of course, instrument family and replacement reagent policy in the IVD space as well. So you have all of these sort of pockets of specific technology specific or intended use specific interpretations of how we're going to go about ensuring the safety and effectiveness of modifications to previously cleared devices. And then ML really starts to pick up a lot of steam, and people start to think about, well, what are we going to do about it in that context? And so in 2022 or so, Congress passed and the president signed a law that established new authority for the FDA to grant authorizations of predetermined change control plans as part of a marketing submission for a device. And this covers planned modifications that would otherwise require a 510(k) or some other kind of marketing review by the FDA. And it says, look, if you make the changes that you're planning to make, and if you validate them the way that you're planning to validate them, and if you get FDA's buy-in on how all of that is going to happen in advance, then as long as you meet the acceptance criteria that you set out in those plans, you can go ahead and deploy that when ready. And I say deploy when ready, but it's important to note that this covers everything from artificial intelligence to more traditional software to hardware. So there's no particular scope that the law establishes for predetermined change control plans. It can really cover a wide variety of medical device changes. And it's an important new option for companies who can plan ahead and have a roadmap for their products that they want to implement.
Yep, I think that last one is quite important. You know, you can do this on a PMA, you can do it on a 510K, you can do it on a de novo, you can do it hardware, you can do it software. AI is one where there's obviously a lot of and I think you know, one of the primary pushes for codifying this, and obviously the different guidance documents that have, you know, come out as part of the action plan. Um, so it's one more tool for that you can use, right? There are other tools that people can use, as you mentioned, the existing guidance on modifications to software, but also things like the multiple function device guidance that allows you to draw boundaries around the device within a multiple function device or system, and then make changes in the other parts of the system as long as you don't, you know, impact the safety of the device portion of it, right? So it's part of the toolkit overall, but it's not the only tool in the bag that we have. So then maybe describe in a nutshell, you know, how to think about predetermined change control plans. What is it exactly, and how do you use it?
Sure. I think I want to, you know, but before you can think about how you want to change, you need to be thinking about, there's quite a bit involved in that, right? So you've got your current product. You want to design it for change. You want to be thinking ahead in terms of what might you want to change. And you want to have processes in place that support a planned approach. So, and you know, so as you think about that foundation of change, one of the biggest differences is we, you know, if you're thinking about just that first product, and we'll worry about how it changes later, it can be very difficult for organizations to suddenly think about that pipeline, right? And what types of changes would be appropriate for a PCCP, and what types of changes would be appropriate for not having to go to back to the FDA in the first place already. So having that more of a pipeline view of your product and thinking ahead is really essential if you want to be able to leverage something like a PCCP.
Yeah, and to build on that, I think, you know, in the law, it establishes three big things that the FDA can require to be present in a PCCP. It can require labeling that's required for safe and effective use of the device, notification requirements if something goes wrong, and performance requirements for the changes that you're making under the plan. I think the FDA has come out with, you know, much more detailed recommendations about, you know, what would fall under that in the context of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And they have draft recommendations out there for predetermined change control plans outside of the context of artificial intelligence and machine learning. But I think at the end of the day, you know, much like a requirements document for your device, this gets device specific really quickly, and this gets change specific really quickly. And so you can imagine that a PCCP for model optimization, for example, you know, maybe some retraining within an existing model architecture might look different than one that proposes to change the fundamental architecture of the model, or one that proposes to add additional acquisition systems for inputs to the model. And so really, when you're thinking about a PCCP, you know, yes, go to the guidance documents, look at the detailed recommendations that the FDA has provided, but more importantly, think scientifically about the changes that you want to make and think about how you justify those changes. Think about how you ensure that they are accomplishing what you hope that they will accomplish and how you validate that. And in particular, think about the acceptance criteria that you're going to establish for those changes, because I think that's really the key. You know, I'm not a regulator today, but if I were, I would really be thinking about this as a ratchet. This is something that I want to see used to improve the performance of a device over time, not something that I want to see used to permit that to slip, right? And you see that in the statute as well in terms of making sure that the device would remain safe and effective without any change for a PCCP, and also making sure that for a 510K device, for example, it would remain substantially equivalent to the predicate even as it's changed under the PCCP. So those are sort of some high level thoughts about how you can go about structuring this. This is really, you know, planned modifications, a protocol for validating those modifications, and acceptance criteria attached to that protocol.
So what's the benefit of doing a PCCP, and what's the effort if you were looking at that? Because that's ultimately what we have to decide when we're going through this. Should we do this or should we not?
Does it make
What do I
sense?
get out of it, right? And what do I have to do that maybe I wouldn't have to do otherwise, or maybe not for an initial filing at least, right?
Yeah, I think when you're thinking about should I or shouldn't I, thinking about your product beyond the first release is always a good idea. Always thinking about that. But the reality is that the PCCP is quite a bit of information to plan and provide in your submission. So you need to be thinking about the risk benefit. For example, it's more to review during the same timeline. And unless you submit as a separate just your PCCP. But if you think about, are we going to do this? At least planning and thinking through it is a good idea. But creating the information, focusing on that next piece before you've even had a chance to get your first product done and authorized can be quite a bit that is more to review. It creates risk for timeline, and it might just end up being too much, right? So that's something to think about. On the other hand, if that is fits your business need, and you think that you have a pretty good idea of maybe the first few releases of your product and how you want to extend it, and you want to architect your product and your processes to enable that, it can get you into the FDA sooner on a newer, a smaller scope product with some very clear planned updates to that product that would fit the PCCP scope. So it really does depend on how sure you are of those different changes, how ready you are to explain that, plan that, have processes in place to achieve that, including knowing your acceptance criteria and your protocol. And that's the trade-off.
Yeah, I would say for changes that actually require a PCCP, right? Because we shouldn't be pursuing a PCCP for any change that we have another reason we can make without FDA review. No benefit in that situation. But for changes that would actually require a PCCP for us to make them without going back to the FDA with an additional marketing application. If you consider a 510K device, the value of a PCCP is about 270 days times the number of times you use it. 90 days for FDA's review, 180 days up to for your response to any questions the FDA asks. Maybe it's closer to 150 on average. Maybe it's even a little bit lower than that. But in terms of sort of working out your Gantt charts and planning your future, I always advise clients try to give yourself 270 days if you can for a 510K so that you're not cutting off the time you have to respond to questions if or when the questions come. And that makes a PCCP pretty phenomenally valuable for many of the changes that it can be used for. I think the trade-off there, and I think Megan highlighted this well, is that it can be hard to get. It's a big deal, and particularly for more more advanced changes, it takes some work to review that on the FDA side and make sure that it's buttoned up and is going to accomplish what it needs to accomplish from a safety and effectiveness perspective, and that you're capable of implementing it as a company. And so that effort is real on their side, and that means that the initial access to the market can be delayed if you're including a PCCP in your first 510K, just in the sense that it can extend the review of that first 510K a little bit as they are trying to work out all of those issues. Generally, they're going to have to decide first whether or not they think this version of the product is safe and effective before they start contemplating too much or in too much depth whether or not a PCCP is appropriate. And so I think that that's something to consider when you're looking for that initial market access. Frankly, when companies come to me and say, "Oh yeah, we've heard about this PCCP thing. We think we'll tack that on to our 510K." Often my advice is, okay, let's consider that. But don't expect that to come without some timeline cost and some effort up front to really get this buttoned down. This is not something that's easy to get the FDA to agree to. You really do have to be quite rigorous in what you're proposing.
Yeah, I think, I always think of regulatory strategy as kind of modular, right? You can have different things that you can say, let's put them all in one. You should, when you put everything in one, you're going to have a lot more questions, a lot more scrutiny, because there's risk for the regulator as well. They want to make sure that they understand all of this. And so if you bundle everything, if one part of that bundle is problematic for them, the whole bundle is delayed, right? So sometimes if there are people that have successfully bundled lots of things together, but very often there is a let's get one part of the bundle in and then let's get another in, etc. And maybe those are things that even can be done uh, in parallel.
I was just
Brendan,
going to
you
add,
yeah,
I
go
was
ahead.
just going to add, I think it's really important that organizations know their why, know their objective. So there are all these tools in the regulatory toolbox. There's tools in the quality management system toolbox, and in the system architecture software development toolbox that can enable, you can, to kind of streamline your regulatory burden and filings and timelines. But it's really important to know what your objective is and make sure that whatever strategy you use helps you with, achieve that objective, that business objective.
And you
So
alluded to a common one there, actually. One of my favorite uses for a PCCP, it gives you some autonomy on launch dates, right? So if you know that you're going to want to launch version 2 of your product in, I don't know, May 1st, 2026. It's very hard to get your clearance timed for exactly that date. But if you can get the FDA to buy off on the protocol and the validation that you're going to be doing, you might finish in February and still have that, time to delay if it's important for you to launch a particular conference, for example. Or it just may give you that additional flexibility and autonomy over when you want to make your big announcement about the cool new version of your technology. And so it's always nice to have that autonomy as a company.
absolutely.
We talked yesterday about kind of parallel paths and separating these things out, right? Because you don't have to file a PCCP, with another filing. It can be a separate 510K filing, and it could also be a 510K could be just an update to the PCCP as well. So you can separate, you know, different things in this and have some of these things going on in parallel, where you have new features, things that couldn't fit into a PCCP. That's one path, and then you have the PCCP uh, expansion as another path as well. Um, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, in regulatory, there aren't necessarily a lot of wrong answers. There are some very wrong answers, but in general, from a strategy standpoint and what you put in one submission versus another, we have options. I think there are a lot of companies where the right option for them turns out to be, look, let's prioritize initial market access for version 1 of this product. Let's make the simplest submission that we can justify for that. And let's put that forward to the FDA and try to have the most streamlined interaction we can. And then let's follow that up, the day after clearance, even potentially, with an update where we add a predetermined change control plan for that technology. FDA talks a little bit about this in its draft guidance on PCCPs. I think they say in the context of a 510(k) device, they consider a PCCP to be part of the technological characteristics of the device. So I do think adding a PCCP to a device, even if you're not making other changes, does count as a change to the device that can result in a 510(k). Um, you know, I think that's the right answer here. We'll see how it works out in practice. I have seen a few submission summaries where it really does look like the main change was a change to the PCCP or the addition of a PCCP. And so that's a nice way to modularize this if you don't want to, add any risk to your initial market access timeline, but you do want to make sure that you're giving yourself as much flexibility for planned changes in the future. Sometimes two submissions is the way to go. That said, if you've had a good pre-sub, if you know that everybody's bought in, I don't think there's a reason not to include your PCCP in that first 510(k), particularly when you have that buy-in in advance.
Right. Makes sense. Is anyone doing PCCPs?
I think they are. So I think, we're coming up on 60 or so is what I would say. And that's in that formal program of predetermined change control plans. And again, I think it's important to acknowledge that many of these concepts that we're talking about have been used at the FDA and, across the industry for many years outside of the context of the specific new label that we have for it and the specific new authority that makes it very explicit that the FDA can authorize these. But I think that under that umbrella term of PCCP, I think it's probably 57. I think you can probably find 59 or so examples where the term has been used in a clearance package or an approval order statement for a PMA. And it really covers everything from more recently model architecture updates, which I think is a really encouraging sign to see included in a predetermined change control plan. Again, to compatibility with additional like image acquisition systems, for example, if you have a image processing system or an image analysis system, computer aided detection or something like that, that is relying on artificial intelligence and machine learning. So lots of variety, really as diverse as medical devices are diverse in terms of what we're seeing authorized in PCCPs.
I know you actually published kind of a list of those out there. If you wouldn't mind sharing that with the audience, I think we can put it in the into the there we go. Yep. And so I think that's
I think I just sent that only to the panelists. Let me repeat that message to the audience. Sorry, folks.
right.
Give me 1
Well,
second.
that's all that matters, really. So yeah. Yeah, but we were looking at this yesterday and just looking at obviously the sort of specific term predetermined change control plan and draft guidance and authority is relatively new. So for the ones that mention that, I think what we counted yesterday was somewhere around 12 before the start of 2024, and the other 55 or sorry 45 or 47 are all in 2024. So lots more activity uh going forward. um and I expect as we keep going forward, we're going to see, uh as with anything, right, there's sort of, oh, this is a clear pattern, substituting one image acquisition device for another, et cetera. Oh, that's a pattern we see, and there are going to be fairly standard ones, but someone is going to get something new and different in there that then will be patterns, and people will start feeling more comfortable with those. Regulators will feel more comfortable as well. Oh, and
So I was having
Brendan,
trouble with the chat, but this QR code, if you scan it with your cell phone, should take you to a list of predetermined change control plans that the FDA has authorized. So I'll just leave this up for a moment.
Yeah. So those are good ones to go in if you're sort of looking at trying to look at patterns that are out there. All of them describe the summaries do just if there is a PCCP there, they will describe it and what the parts are of that um but if it hasn't been done before, it does not mean you can't can't go there, right? Obviously, you have to stay within, you know, ultimately being, as with anything, being able to explain what's the intended use of your device, how you're demonstrating safety and effectiveness, and how you're doing that for the characterized changes that you have, right? That's ultimately what you have to do. If you stay within that, there's a chance that you can get a PCCP, but no guarantee of that.
And Brendan had mentioned something I want to just make sure people remember too, is also the pre-sub tool, right? So having a pre-sub is we highly encourage in many cases using that to have a conversation with the FDA if you're thinking about putting a PCCP into your submission. So if you're thinking about that, so having that conversation in advance can also be helpful. I think we've got a couple of questions, Bernard. Um, see the first, do you want to?
Yeah, so yeah, let's go with it. So this one's interesting. Any thoughts around how PCCP can be applied to AI ML devices that rely on consumer electronics, so fitness wearables, sunglasses, etc.
I'm thinking this question, I'm assuming this means maybe where your general computing platform is a fitness wearable, maybe, or glasses or something like that. I'm not sure if that's specifically the question, but in terms of managing change for that general computing platform, depending on the specific impact, you may not even need to go back to the FDA. But if you have additional functionality that would be regulated indications or something like that, that you are thinking about in terms of that kind of that functionality that sits on top of those devices. So, you have like, for example, an app, a SAMD app that runs on, glasses, something like Google Glasses or something like that. Or you've got something that runs on a watch or something like that. That's where you could apply the PCCP depending on the change that you're planning. Brenda, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think we've got sort of two big scenarios we can think about here. Whenever possible, you want to use the existing modifications policies to make updates to your technologies rather than a PCCP, right? So if we're really just talking about where the AI/ML happens to run, right? And if we've done our homework from a technical perspective and we have something that's really rather portable and should run well almost anywhere, then hopefully that's a change that we can really argue for making under the established modifications policies that the FDA has. But if you're talking instead maybe about an AI/ML model that is taking as input some data from an accelerometer in a consumer wearable or a camera in a consumer wearable or any number of other sensors or technologies that might be in that platform. Um, Now I think you are probably moving closer to the type of application where a predetermined change control plan would be appropriate and perhaps necessary, frankly, to add new acquisition systems over time, because there are a lot of concerns out there about minor changes in the nature of the input data really perturbing these models and influencing their performance in a way that results in them not working as well as we would hope when the acquisition system changes. And a PCCP can be a good way to establish a protocol for verifying that that's not happening before listing a artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithm as compatible with a new data acquisition system. So I think that that's an excellent use case for a PCCP and one that you'll see, at least several times on the list of authorized PCCPs that are out there.
I would say that deployed models on smartphones, sometimes you have dependencies for, say, floating point calculation on the GPU itself. And so if that is one of the things that you have for your device, then you need to take that into consideration as for your testing and for tuning your models as well, potentially, right? You know, not always, but it can sometimes be a case. So in a case like that, you may need to do a PCCP may even be needed for something where it's you're deploying it on different smartphones, or even with the same smartphone model, you may have different chips and different GPUs in there. So being even more fine-grained in terms of that, that would also make sense in terms of a PCCP.
That's a great point, and it's a good reminder that a lot of the failure modes we see with artificial intelligence and machine learning, it's not like traditional software is immune from them, right? It may be more
Right.
common, but I think there's like the Patriot missile example related to the floating point calculation issue. I may be remembering wrong, but yeah, a classic mistake essentially in software engineering, and uh, a good reminder of why regression testing is so important and why integration testing is so important for these technologies, whether you're talking about a PCCP or not.
Yeah, you can't necessarily assume that it's going to work universally across all platforms, whether it's just plain old software or whether there's a ML model involved.
And thinking
Um,
about that, your
mhm.
design process is really important. So as you're thinking about designing your product, you have an opportunity to be thinking about this to kind of mitigate, lower your risk, or plan, how are you going to be porting, what specific aspects of your system might be impacted the most as you start to extend or go to different platforms. So there's some opportunity there as well, which makes it a lot easier to say, well, I know how to identify my change. Here's specifically the impact assessment. And that provides some of that structure to support a PCCP or any other change.
Without growing into too much detail, is this sort of, your how likely you are to get a PCCP through is, pretty universal within the agency? And are there different areas where it's more common, less likely, more, less risk averse? I don't need you to name any names per se, but how would you characterize that?
Yeah, and I think that's a good call out to Allison's comment in the Q&A about
Hmm.
consistency across the agency. This, we're in very early days, right? 60 or so PCCPs is not a lot yet, and I think that over time we're going to see a tremendous number of these, over the coming years. And so FDA doesn't even have a final guidance on PCCPs for devices outside of the context of artificial intelligence and machine learning. My, you know, my experience, which is a few years old now, and I certainly don't speak for the FDA today. My experience is that training tends to roll out after guidances are finalized. Industry gets really upset when FDA implements guidance before it's been finalized, and so FDA is careful, frankly, not to do training before they should. So I'm sure that PCCPs are getting covered in the sense that there is a statute out there. It is the law of the land, and so staff are familiar with it. They're being trained on it from that perspective. But I think some of the more detailed recommendations, for example, that you would find in the FDA's guidances, they aren't all final. And until they're final, it's unlikely that the FDA is going to be doing, major training rollouts or trying to enforce consistency on those recommendations across the groups. Um, it's also a challenging topic because there's not a standard for granting a PCCP that is separate from the standard for clearing a 510(k), granting a de novo, or approving a PMA. And so ultimately, these things are getting put out there based on the existing statutory standards for clearance granting and approval. And that means that, it can be harder to argue, especially in early days, that you're entitled to authorization of the PCCP that you've proposed. When there's a good precedent for you to point to, potentially as a reference device in the context of a 510K, for example, you can make a stronger argument. But I think we are still in those early days of negotiating with the agency about what's justifiable and why. And that's really what this comes down to. What's justifiable and why from a scientific perspective, why this PCCP is sufficient for us to conclude that this product, this device is going to remain safe and effective as it's modified. And if you can make that case, I think, life is good. But it is a difficult interaction still in some contexts. And I think not without good reason, but it can still be a difficult interaction.
There's another good question from.
I had one more on this,
Yeah.
but thanks for keeping us honest on the questions, Megan. If we look at just where most clearances have happened for AI ML, it's heavily in radiology, right? Imaging, waveforms, cardiology, secondary, and then a little sprinkling here and there, right? So if you think about where there's the most precedent, it's in those areas. And other areas we will get more and more, but it's a much smaller subset of what we have in those areas. So that's where I would expect, there are certain problem sets that you're not going to find in radiology that are going to be somewhere else where, new edge cases, new things have to be thought of that really, that where there's not an established path. So it's going to evolve over the next few years. Megan, you were gonna
Oh no,
ask another one, yeah?
absolutely. I was thinking of some examples too of different situations that have come up, and I think Yu's question was really good about if company has version A, kind of this timeliness. You've got version A cleared, and then two new 510Ks in parallel for major update. Is there a challenge with having some parallel submissions? Do PCCPs create some challenges for parallel submissions and parallelizing kind of new functionality or changes or versions of the product? Brendan, have you seen any examples of that, or can you think of any?
I think that PCCPs can certainly introduce some complexity into your revision level history, right? And the interactions that you're having with the FDA as a result. There are some regulatory nuances associated with that. When you come back to the FDA later for a change that you can't make under your PCCP, for example, and you're doing, again, I mostly live in the 510K program, so let's talk about that. If you're doing a modification to an existing device and you're citing a prior version of your device as the predicate, you actually really have to cite the version that the FDA cleared. If you have a PCCP, you can't just compare to the version that you modified of your own accord under the PCCP. And so that's important to remember. A lot of PCCPs end up getting structured in a way where when you're doing comparisons of the proposed change versus previous versions, you're comparing not just to sort of the N-1 version of your technology, but you're actually comparing to that version and the version that was cleared. So you'll often see that type of control built into the PCCP as a result. And so this can get a little bit nuanced and complex, and certainly when it comes to interacting with the FDA, I think configuration management and being unambiguous in your communication ends up being a huge part of the game and a huge part of your success. And so if you want to introduce this complexity into your pipeline, it's important to be able to accommodate it and to be able to articulate things clearly as you do.
And I think that's a really good point. I think that it's also helpful, maybe even in a pre-sub, internally you have to be able to explain all this branching, right? And what's common between and what's not. You already have to do that. But it might be helpful to lay that out very clearly with the FDA so that they can have that context and that visual of all these different versions.
I think we should maybe try to look at a couple of examples because been talking about it in general terms. I know, you know, as we talked about, there are a lot of different ones, and each one is, is a little bit different. I think as Allison had mentioned in the comments. But let's pick out a couple and go through that. Brendan, do you want to go first? I've got a non-device, sorry, non-AI one that I can talk about. But maybe we
Sure.
start with the AI one first.
Yeah, I think we talked a lot about sort of adding new acquisition systems, for example, updating model weights. One that I saw recently that I thought was interesting, and I see, Allison's in the chat here, but the Screen DX PCCP, which was under K24-1891. I just read the publicly available information on that, and I thought it was a pretty interesting one, and it covers model architecture updates as well as model weight updates, and I think that that's a nice incremental advancement here. I'm not sure that's the first one to do that. It might be, but I certainly thought that was notable, and it was a recent example, cleared just this past January. So that one I thought was encouraging from an AI/ML perspective.
Um, for a non-AI one, 23andMe did one. I think they filed it in 2022. I think Dwayne Herbig, who's a friend and collaborator of ours, may be on the call as well, but he was involved in that. It's number K223597. And it's on Brendan's list as well. So for those of you who want to look at it, um, so 23andMe has a genetic health risk report for cancer predisposition, and the 510(k) looked at 44 variants of two genes that produce proteins that help repair damaged DNA. So they're cancer suppressors essentially. And they filed a 510(k) in December of 2022 for 41 new variants. There were three in there in the predicate. And they also filed a PCCP for additional validated variants as part of that. And so essentially they're doing the same thing on the same equipment, and they describe the types of changes, how it's limited. So the addition of single nucleotide variants and small insertions and deletions, less than 20 BP, whatever that means, in these two particular genes. And then describe the clinical validation criteria that had to be met, the specific analytical validation protocols, and the acceptance criteria to ensure the performance characteristics are met. Otherwise, the same, yes, you have to do V and V, and you have to do change control for labeling and other things within this. So in this case, not AI ML, but really, clear, you're following the same process as you really did for the other variants, and you're describing that and how you're going to ensure what the protocols are and the results and all of that and what the thresholds are for that. That, kind of model you think of for other types of things as well. I will say that they received clearance on that in August of 2023. So from December to August, that is roughly 8 months or so. So it was not a, 90 days and you're done kind of a thing. I don't know to what extent, what the issues were, how many of those were around oh, and Dwayne says base pairs is what BP means. Thank you. I'm not a genetic expert on this, but certainly that was that was a 8 months is longer than average for that. In any case, that is that's that example in the non-device one, I haven't gone through your list, Brendan, to see how many, sorry, non-device, non-AI. I don't know how many of those are non-AI, but I assume it's a small number of those 59
Yeah, I
or
suppose I haven't
57.
counted, but
Yeah.
I do love that example, and I think one thing it highlights again is just how this program is an example almost of convergent regulatory evolution. You had this approach that the FDA took for the Oncomine DX, the MSK Impact, and the Foundation One CDX tumor profiling tools, back in 2017 or so, and now it's been brought under this umbrella of the PCCP program. Similarly, for antimicrobial susceptibility tests brought under this PCCP program. Similarly, for modifications to AI/ML being brought under this PCCP program. And I think that we're going to continue to see some of those areas where people were really pushing the limits of the established modifications policies in the types of changes that they were letting companies make under certain conditions. For example, it's nice to now have this clear, explicit statutory authority for predetermined change control plans that makes it clear that the FDA can not only permit these kinds of modifications, but can really hold companies to the acceptance criteria that are established in them. And that gives the public really good confidence that these technologies are safe and effective, whether they're going to the FDA for review or whether they're being implemented under a predetermined change control plan. So I think it's nice to see that example.
And I think Yu Zhao mentioned, another collaborative of ours, Yu Zhao mentioned in the chat that from his analysis, there were 27 PCCPs for non-AI ML devices. So yeah, that'd be a great one. I know you had that published that on LinkedIn as well, but
That's a great article. Everybody should go read it.
yeah, yeah. Um, and here's one from Martin, which is PCCP applicable for recurring or iterative changes that we are often foreseeing for AI? An example is retraining of neural networks with new additional data you're collecting, or will the PCCP in that case only be applicable for one single retraining?
Uh, More than one.
Yeah.
I would say if you're only doing one, it's maybe not even worth the PCCP. That said, this is tough to do well, right? Um, First, if you're having to retrain constantly, is that a device that would remain safe and effective without the change, right? So that's going to be the first question that the FDA asks when they're considering whether or not a PCCP is appropriate for that. Um, if so, if you have all that much more performance to squeeze out of the model, are you really ready to go to market? I think that's sort of another question that's going to come early, and you might be. There are times when it makes plenty of sense to do these kinds of updates. Um, will users tolerate changes in the output over time, or is this going to hamper their confidence in the reliability of your product if it's changing underneath them constantly as they're using it? And then again, another challenge with this is just having a really good reference method to label the data so that you can do retraining, right? So how true is your truth? How fast is your truth coming for this in terms of enabling those more continuous model updates and coverage? Do you have a good source of truth that you can use to label for enough of your cases? Or are you going to end up accidentally maybe biasing your model for some subset of cases as a result of this type of retraining? And so I think the short answer to this is yes, you can retrain more than once. And the longer answer to this is scientifically, this gets complicated fast, and it's going to take a very carefully designed, thorough plan.
And I would say another part of that, this is kind of if we not just for AI ML, but it's particularly critical here. You mentioned sort of source of truth, right? What is your reference standard and how easy and is it to get that that data, or how expensive or cheap is it, right? One of the reasons why in radiology this is used an awful lot is because the reference standard is radiologists in the loop looking at things, right? So you're getting that until such a point as radiologists are out of the loop, right? Until then, it is easy to get that to get that data compared to say something where you have to have for continuous glucose monitoring, right? The reference standard is a blood test, and you need to get that blood test every 5 minutes or so, or over a certain period of time. That's a very expensive reference standard to get. And that's one reason why there's a lot less AI in the diabetes space at this point for these types of things than there is in radiology.
I love that example. And even in radiology, there's the truth that's true enough for labeling for the purposes of training the next version of your algorithm. And then there's the truth that's true enough for validation. And those may be
Right.
different, right?
Hmm.
So you may be looking at a panel of experts potentially for your study for that model update. It really depends on the application, but I do think that it's something to think through carefully before you make your proposal to the FDA.
I know we have more questions in here. I think one we were asking ourselves is like, and we've alluded to some answers to it already. When should you not do a PCCP? What are sort of, what are the reasons? Like, what questions should you ask yourself? Should I do a PCCP or not? And when, what are the answers that say, nope, we shouldn't do it?
I'll start by going back to do you know your objective? And do you have enough information about your product, the product use, to be able to think through what changes make sense that would fall under PCCP, and what those acceptance criteria, what your protocol, what your acceptance criteria are, and do you have the discipline in your organization to follow that PCCP? So I think those are some, in terms of just culturally for your organization, are you ready to do that? Does it actually benefit you? Is the cost of doing the work going to benefit you for this, or would you be better off just having a follow-on submission? So those are some initial sets of questions. In addition to, does it even apply? Is this a change that I would have to go back to the FDA in the first place? Do I need a PCCP for this, or is this something that would the change would follow under a different vehicle, right? Cybersecurity, for example, does not require, going back to the FDA for. So things like that. So is it even appropriate? But also, I think what I see in terms of organizations is really having that discipline to be able to think through changes and your protocol.
I think the only thing I'll add to that is that the answer today might be a little different than the answer next year. Um, you know, Again, it's still pretty early for this program. I think that as people get more comfortable, as we get more precedents to look to here in terms of what's been accepted in the past, and as more FDA review staff get familiar with the program and have the experience of having implemented it and understand why it's something that they can trust and rely on in terms of the rigor that goes into these plans, you're going to see it become a little bit more standard for more devices. I think that today this is something where the business case has to be very strong for a company to really make that choice to be trailblazers on this and push forward with it. But it's going to become increasingly common over time, and we're going to see a broader diversity of the types of modifications that are covered under it over time.
I would add to that. I think, how many changes, if you can well characterize this, right, and know the types of changes, how many changes are you expecting over what period of time? Um, just because you can do a PCCP, and you could theoretically do 100 changes, um, how many are you actually capable of making in that period of time, right? That's the other question. If you are, if it, if your processes and your tooling and everything else means you can't release software, in more frequency than every 6 months or so, chances are this is going to be really difficult for you and probably less valuable than if you are already, have kind of capability and maturity to do non-device, non 510K requiring releases every month or every 2 weeks or so, right? If you can already do that, then you can probably get more hits out. But you got to figure that out as well, right? If you don't have that and you are, it took you a year to get the first one, and maybe with a little bit of optimization, it'll get down to 9 months or 8 months. I'm not sure there's that much value in the PCCP other than flexibility, but then you gotta trade that off against, the extra work that you have to do and the extra potential time that your 510K might take.
Yeah, don't just do this to have another feather in your cap.
Right. Yep. Um, there was a question on kind of uh the future of AI AMD, so AI in medical devices or software as a medical device. Is it going to grow, or do we think people won't bother? So uh
I'll take that. I've been working with startups, medical device startups, and medical device adjacent type of startups for over 10 years. I don't see this going away anytime soon. I think that it will accelerate. I think that SAMD and AI as a medical device or in a medical device, I think it provides quite a few opportunities to benefit patients, benefit healthcare providers. So I think there's quite a bit of value uh, that could be delivered. With that said, it's not a panacea for everything, but I suspect that there will be an acceleration. I think that as the FDA and other regulators start embracing it, if you will, and more, the frameworks for this will become probably more streamlined, possibly better. But I think there'll be quite a bit more. Brendan, what's your thought?
I don't think I would argue with that. You know, um, so technological capability drives adoption and interest, and also um, demonstration of that technological capability drives adoption and interest, right? And so I think that we're seeing a lot of reasons to be optimistic about how well these technologies can work in a variety of contexts. And I think that, there are folks who are waiting to see that proven out in practice. So I do think it's important for us to remember those two sides of it. It's good to see the potential capability, and I think that we're seeing lots and lots of signals of incredible potential capability here. And I think also, if we want to do things like, replace human experts for certain tasks, we really need to do our homework and show that we can do that well. And so it's up to us to generate the evidence, to study these thoroughly, and to show that they're working for the things that we're proposing them to be used for. And if we do, they'll get adopted.
Yeah, I think sort of leaving aside the regulations, right? Um, Mark Andreessen in 2011 wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. Software is eating the world. Every company will need to be a software company eventually. You could sort of do a corollary to that. AI is eating the world, and AI is enabled by software is also eating the world, and AI is going to be everywhere eventually. So that is just inevitable, whether it's regulated or not. Right now, the question is, the regulations are there to ensure safety and effectiveness, but also enable innovation. So the dual role there for the FDA. I think we're going to keep pushing for, inevitably more and more complex things, where there is more and more patient risk, and we're going to have to come up with new ways of managing those things, and we're going to have to continue to evolve how we ensure that safety and effectiveness. But I think there are also going to be certain things that become kind of, yeah, we thought we needed to do something around here, and we can probably use enforcement discretion around these things, as has happened for certain other, for certain things. MDDS at one point was class 3, and now it's not a device. Um, I expect certain things to go in that same direction as we push, towards ever more amazing and yet complex things, right? Um, what other questions did we have here? There was one on how to handle this in the context of PMAs. Uh, Anyone want to take a crack at that one?
That's the type of question that I know I'll mess up if I try to answer it live. So I
Yep.
do know also though that I believe in the final guidance on artificial intelligence and machine learning PCCPs, the FDA has a section on submission types. I think that there's also a corresponding section in the draft guidance on PCCPs for all devices. I believe they're consistent, and I believe that they talk about which submission types the FDA recommends for these, and I think it does include some PMA supplements. So I think the answer's out there for you, and I think we know where to look.
Perfect. There was one around kind of, can changes made entirely under an approved PCCP eventually trigger the need for a catch-up 510K? Um,
I would hope not. Hard to rule out in a broad hypothetical sense, but it doesn't seem like if we do a good job in constructing our PCCP, that should be the result. I would think that changes made under a PCCP that are in accordance with that PCCP, uh, my understanding is that there's not a reason why that would trigger the need for a catch-up 510K. Again, the FDA can have notification requirements if the changes don't go as expected. So there could be something there if something goes wrong potentially. But no, when things go right and are therefore in accordance with the PCCP, you're legally marketed.
yeah. I will say this, right? I think we may see some things over time based on what we see now, but I do know, so PCCP is more narrow than um you know the software changes, right? When you have to file, when you don't have to file for software changes. That covers a lot more things than PCCP does. PCCP expands it, but in that guidance, there is the concept of kind of an accumulation of a bunch of changes that at some point you may need to do a catch-up 510K of some kind. That clause is there. How much that is actually used or not, I don't know. But I could see sometime that we get to some specific area where it's like, yeah, at some point you should file, because while a 510K is substantially equivalent, each time you move you move that a little bit, is it still substantially equivalent to something, to the original one that you had? So I could
Possibly,
see that happening in
possibly a pre-sub.
yeah,
Yeah, so maybe a pre-sub in there somewhere to
yeah,
avoid that
yeah.
situation.
Yeah, I guess the question is also, what's the lifetime of your medical devices? Is this, are you going to have it? Is this going to be on the market for 35 years, or is this going to be replaced, planned obsolescence, et cetera, with something else in it where it's not really going to get used in 5 years? So, those may be different circumstances as well.
I'm gonna hang my hat on a nuance of the wording in the question, which is changes made entirely under an approved
Yes,
PCCP.
yes, that's true. That's true.
No
Yeah.
510K. That's
Yeah.
my answer in that context. But um, look, if we do our jobs well, we plan ahead in a way that really minimizes the need for um, 510Ks that wouldn't have a lot of value.
Yep. Um, There was a question on what changes we would like to see in the current, you know, regulations and guidance, new regulatory pathways for AI ML, more structured reviews, bring back the pre-cert.
Bernard's teasing me.
I am, yes.
So I think there's a broad perception that the regulatory framework in the United States is pretty cookie cutter and pretty consistent in a bad way. In that you have like this idea of this, there's class one, there's class two, there's class three. If you're class one, then this. If you're class two, then that. And if you're class three, then the other thing. In practice, FDA's regulatory framework is pretty modular. You can have class two exempt technologies that are subject to special controls. You have class one technologies that are not technically exempt from 510K. And so you end up with all of these sort of fuzzy borders between these broad categories of products that are otherwise relatively consistent. I don't think we've made full use of the flexibility that we have in the existing framework, frankly. I think that the addition of PCCP authority was phenomenally important to helping us use that flexibility appropriately. But I would like to see more application of the existing flexibilities that are built into the framework that we have today. You hear often, this was not designed with artificial intelligence and machine learning in mind. And, that may or may not be true. Turing was around before the medical device amendments, and lots of people were thinking about artificial intelligence when software was first regulated by the FDA in 1976. But I do think that, part of our job is to use what we have fully, while we also look always for whether there are better ways, right? So I'm not against that, but I think that as we consider alternative approaches, it's important to look at what we have. I'd like to see more technologies moved into that exempt bucket, frankly, rather than, say, enforcement discretion or something else that might be a little more tenuous or a little bit more nuanced in terms of how it ends up working out in practice. I'd like to see a little bit more class two exempt, frankly, where we're using special controls and other mechanisms to ensure that these technologies are performing well and are serving the public well, while also minimizing the need for pre-market review in areas where those special controls can do that sufficiently, for example.
I like that. And I would add, I don't know that this is necessarily a change to the framework, but one of the things I've seen quite a bit, especially when introducing AIML or data into your product portfolio, is it's a little bit challenging to transition from um, kind of this maybe wellness technology and start adding medical device functionality later. Right now, the framework is generally you start with your device classification. Um, and that's where it gets a little bit tricky on that front end, because if you ever think you're going to be regulated in your software, you need to be thinking ahead, because the design process is the manufacturing process, right, for software. So there are things, maybe light controls, or at least architecturally in your platform architecture, thinking about really building in that regulatory flexibility right into your system architecture. I've seen situations where companies have, they might even have some clinical data that they'd like to use, but having to go back and say, well, what version was that? What did we exactly use? It's very difficult to plan that traceability. So when it comes to data in particular, and ML that's using data, thinking about a data architecture early on, but also in the regulatory framework, kind of, I would say, not waiting until the end for some of the validation principles. So really thinking more about, I have this, set of functionality that I want to ultimately deliver, and there might be submissions along the way, but thinking about kind of building in your regulatory, uh, you know, riverbanks, if you will, right into your architecture, so that you have a modular architecture. You have different components, maybe one component is a class 2 and one component is enforcement discretion. Kind of thinking about the functionality a little bit differently. I would really like to see frameworks that think about software in that way, the same way that it would be designed. So that is the one change that I would like to see.
Yeah, I think, you know, look, their technology is always going to move faster outside of the medical device space than the regulations have time to catch up with. It's just the nature of the beast, right? And but I do feel like there may be some areas where maybe we need different paradigms. Um, I know that the pre-cert was an attempt to shift the paradigm, but it was also something that, uh, you know, frankly, the FDA did not actually have authority to do, um, and that needed whether you think it was a good idea or not, the FDA can't go beyond the mandate of what Congress has authorized it to do, which is why the whole PCCP authorization in 2022 was so key to actually pushing this out. So, look, I think there are always things that we can critique and say, oh, I'd like to see this, I'd like to see that. I know in our conversations, at among, in the various committees of AdvaMed and among CEOs, et cetera, maybe 10 years ago, there was a lot of dissatisfaction with the FDA. Since the device fees and adding more people, a lot of folks don't think that the biggest problem is the FDA and how we're doing things. I think the FDA, through 2024 has made tremendous progress. I think the biggest issue is really much more around how things get paid for and how long it takes and what the process is for that, right? There are changes I would love to see in how CMS is organized, which also takes legislation, right? Certain rules within that around revenue neutrality, cost neutrality between different buckets, that it's all, within one particular area within CMS. If we just change that one thing and made the cost neutrality be across the entire portfolio at CMS, it would unlock an awful lot of things. That would be a much bigger and more impactful change than a few things that we would be doing within FDA. So I think we're getting close to the end. Do we have time for one more question? Um, oh, I think Yuzhao had another comment on the PMA supplements. Uh, So he said in 7 PMA supplements containing PCCP in approval order statement, unfortunately, SSED is only required for the original PMA and major supplements, and we don't have any details on PCCPs for those 7 PMA supplements. And he wonders why the agency did not push for or find a way to allow more transparency related to PCCPs for the riskier class 3 devices. Interesting.
Yeah, I think we we always want more transparency on others' devices and less on ours.
Yes,
Is
that's
sort
right.
of the general perspective that most companies seem to have here. Um, you know, uh, I welcome SSED's summaries of safety and effectiveness data that provide a clear understanding of what the planned modifications might be, or maybe some subset of that information in terms of what's going out there. But I will say I'm glad to see the FDA noting the presence of a PCCP in the approval order statement in a way that helps us at least see the utilization of the program so that we can have broader ongoing conversations with them about what's happening and what isn't. So I suppose my answer here is I'll take it. Yes,
Right.
I'd love more, and also I'm gonna give credit where credit's due on what they've done to date. It's a new program. They're working under difficult circumstances, and personally, I found them to be relatively open-minded on this, although still, characteristically, they're tough cookies as they should be, and we've got to do our job making our case.
Agreed. So any closing statements from you guys? Megan, Brendan?
Sure. Um, I think, in closing, ultimately, I think it's valuable for companies to think about utilizing a PCCP when they're planning out their kind of their product pipeline or different offering. Whether you specifically submit it or timing of when you submit it, how long it might take you to do, how that adds complexity, that really depends on the situation. But I think there's quite a bit of value in leveraging all of the tools in the regulatory toolbox to streamline getting that product from concept into, safe and effective product into the hands of the patients and the clinicians, healthcare providers that need them. So I applaud the FDA for having created another framework to help manufacturers achieve those objectives. I think it's a really important tool to consider in your regulatory strategy.
Yeah, I think my general advice to folks is if you can fairly convince yourself, you can convince your regulator, right? So think about it from that perspective. Think about it scientifically. We can get into the nuances of all the different policies and the regulatory jargon and this, that, and the other. But at the end of the day, this is a scientific discussion about what we can fairly conclude about the performance of a device. And if you come at it from that perspective, you'll do a good job and you'll put something together that regulators can say yes to, and that's good news. I think, you know, I really appreciate the conversation today. It's nice to get together and talk about sort of a nuanced, interesting, detailed topic like this. We also do need to remember as a community that we have some broader concerns right now that we all need to be working on as well. And so I'll bounce us back out to that broader discussion, or at least just allude to it briefly. We have some work to do to make sure that we have a regulator with capacity and credibility going forward, and we all need to do our part to ensure that.
Yeah, I would second that. And look, we as members of the community, as companies, as um, you know, participants and members of RAPS and of MDIC and AdvaMed and all of the other ones, as groups, we have power and we can influence things. That means we need to raise our voices. Um, uh, you can talk to your congressman. You can talk to the regulators. You can leave comments. You can, as as an association, you can lobby. You can raise your voice, and it does not happen without all of us participating and without all of us doing that. We're the ones who have to make the changes. No one else is going to do it for us. So on that note, thank you everyone, and look forward to seeing more of you at our next webinar. Feel free to send comments, questions, etc. We love hearing from you. And thanks to Megan and Brendan. Thanks so much for your expertise and participation.
Thanks for having me.
All right.
So much.
Thanks, guys. All right. Bye-bye.